If you stood outside Bukhara between 706 and 709, Qutaybah's army did not look like a raid that would vanish by sunrise. It looked like the edge of the Umayyad Empire moving toward your gate, carrying orders from Khurasan and power from Damascus. The strange part of Qutaybah ibn Muslim's story is not how fast he won cities like Samarkand. The strange part is that the man who pushed Arab rule deep into Central Asia died in 715, killed by his own troops. That ending matters because it turns this from a simple conquest story into a frontier story about power, fear, and fragile loyalty. To understand what it was like watching Qutaybah arrive, you have to start in Khurasan around 704. Around 704, Qutaybah became governor of Khurasan under the Umayyad rulers Abd al-Malik and then al-Walidi. One standard reference gives Qutaybah command of about 50,000 troops, which meant he controlled a force large enough to change whole regions. But 50,000 troops alone do not explain why places like Balkh, Bukhara, and Samarkand fell under his shadow. Qutaybah was not only a battlefield commander in armor, he was also an organizer who understood Khurasan, Persia, and frontier politics. That is why his story feels so heavy when you imagine a city hearing his name before seeing his banners. In a place like Balkh in 705, people were not only asking who would win a battle. They were asking who would collect tribute, who would stay in charge, and whether old rulers would survive under new masters. Qutaybah's first big phase began in 705 with the recovery of Lower Takhiristan and Balkh. Recovery sounds neat on paper, but on a frontier like Lower Takhiristan, recovery meant marching, sieges, submission deals, and force. A city that heard Qutaybah was coming had to think beyond one day of fighting. It had to think about taxes, hostages, local rulers, Arab garrisons, and whether Persian agents were already inside the political game. That last part is easy to miss, but it helps explain why Qutaybah moved farther than many men with swords alone. He relied heavily on Persian cooperation, Persian agents, and sometimes Persian governors to make conquest work after the first shock. So if you watched his army arrive in 705, you were not only seeing Arabs from Khurasan, you were also seeing a new political machine that could use local knowledge, local intermediaries, and old rivalries. That made Qutaybah harder to resist than a commander who only smashed walls and rode away. Between 706 and 709, the next great test was Bukhara, and Bukhara did not fall into his hands in one simple moment. The campaigns against Bukhara stretched over years, which tells you the city and its region were not easy prizes. If you lived near Bukhara in 706, normal life could still continue between alarms, tribute demands, and fresh military pressure. That is one reason frontier conquest feels so unnerving in real life. The army appears, then leaves, then returns, and each return changes the balance inside the city a little more. Qutaybah understood that repeated pressure could wear down resistance in ways one grand battle could not. But battlefield pressure was only half of his method around Bukhara. He also used Arab settlement and garrisoning in Bukhara to make the conquest stick after the banners were planted. That detail matters because a garrison changes a city long after the noise of siege engines fades. A garrison means soldiers staying, watching gates, shaping markets, and reminding local elites who now stands above them. For families in Bukhara, the arrival of Qutaybah's army was not just a military event. It was the start of a new daily map where Arab troops, local rulers, and tribute demands could all exist together. That mixed system shows why Qutaybah was more dangerous than a reckless raider. He often kept local rulers in place under Arab supervision instead of tearing every old structure down at once. For some elites, that could look like survival. For others, it could feel like humiliation, because the throne remained while real power moved somewhere else. Qutaybah also worked to stabilize Arab factional divisions, which was crucial in Khurasan and beyond the Oxus. An army divided by Arab factional quarrels could lose a frontier before any enemy won a clean victory. So his success depended on holding together not just cities like Bukhara, but also his own side. That is another part of what people would have felt when watching him arrive. They were seeing a commander whose danger came from force outside the walls and order inside his camp. By 710 to 712, the map widened beyond Bukhara into the Oxus Valley, Sogdiana, Samarkand, and Khwarazm. Those years, 710 through 712, were the high tide of Qutaybah's expansion. In the Oxus Valley, conquest meant more than riding through a famous river zone. It meant holding lines of movement, keeping men supplied, and making sure victories in one place did not melt in another. From there, Qutaybah extended power into Sogdiana, a region where every city had its own pride, fears, and political calculations. Then came Samarkand, one of the names that still makes his career sound almost mythic. If you were in Samarkand when Qutaybah closed in, you were not facing a commander chasing glory for one afternoon. You were facing a frontier builder who mixed siege warfare with administration, alliances, and pressure on local rulers. That combination is why Samarkand matters so much in his story. A city like Samarkand did not become important only because it was conquered. It became important because its capture showed that Umayyad power could reach deep into Central Asia when the frontier machine held together. Khwarazm also came under Qutaybah's power during this phase, though the sources around Khwarazm need careful handling. Some later accounts say the educated classes of Khwarazm were devastated after revolt, but those later sources can be biased. So the safest reading is not a movie scene of total destruction in one burst. The safer reading is harsher and still serious. Coercion, revolt, punishment, and frontier brutality were part of these campaigns. That word brutality belongs here because Qutaybah's conquests were not gentle expansion by polite agreement. They included siege warfare, tribute extraction, punitive violence, and the kind of fear that follows armies on contested frontiers. If you watched his forces approach a city gate in Sogdiana or Khwarazm, you knew submission and resistance both carried real costs. Yet Qutaybah did not try to rule Central Asia with Arab muscle alone. He used local auxiliary contingents too, which widened his reach and gave him more tools than one ethnic force could provide. That matters because empires at the edge often win through mixtures, not purity. Arab troops, Persian agents, local auxiliaries, and supervised rulers could all be part of the same frontier system under Qutaybah. By 713 to 715, he pushed farther north and east into the Jaxartes and Ferghana zones. Those names, Jaxartes and Ferghana, tell you how far his campaigns had stretched from the old core of Arab power. Later tradition even credits Qutaybah with reaching the borders of Chinese Turkestan. But that claim about Chinese Turkestan is not securely documented, so it should stay in the realm of later tradition. Even without that border claim, the years 713 to 715 still show a commander operating at astonishing range. And that is where the story changes from expansion to fragility. The farther a frontier commander moves from the center, the more he depends on trust from the center. Qutaybah could manage Bukhara, Samarkand, and Ferghana only as long as Khurasan and the Umayyad court still held behind him. That hidden truth sits under every one of his victories. A city on the edge might think the greatest threat is the army outside the walls. But the greater danger to an empire can be politics back in the capital. Qutaybah served under al-Walid, and that bond mattered more than many people outside the court could see. When al-Walid was alive, Qutaybah's frontier power had backing from the top of the Umayyad state. But in 715, al-Walid died, and Sulayman came to power instead. That change in 715 was not just a new name on a ruler list. For Qutaybah, it was a direct political danger because he had opposed Sulayman's succession. A frontier conqueror can survive many battles and still be undone by one palace change. That is exactly what happened to Qutaybah ibn Muslim in 715. Instead of simply returning and submitting after Sulayman took power, Qutaybah moved toward rebellion. That choice turned a conqueror of Samarkand into a man gambling against his own political base. And then the most important support failed him. He did not secure the full loyalty of his army. Think about how shocking that is after years of success from 705 through 715. The man who had driven through Balkh, Bukhara, Samarkand, and Ferghana could not make all his own troops follow him into rebellion. That tells you his army was loyal in layers, not all in one solid block. Some loyalty was to campaign success, some to pay, some to patronage, and some to the Umayyad center itself. Once Sulayman sat at the top, those layers could split apart. Then came the break that ends his story with betrayal instead of triumph. In 715, Qutaybah's troops mutinied and killed him. He was not brought down by Samarkand rising again in one glorious revenge. He was not slain by a foreign king at the edge of Chinese Turkestan. He died because central politics changed, his rebellion failed, and his own men turned on him. That ending reveals what it was really like to watch his army arrive years earlier. You were seeing a power that looked solid from the outside, but still depended on a chain running back to the center. Break that chain in 715, and the whole frontier structure starts to shake. Older scholarship says Qutaybah's death marked more than one commander's fall. It marked the end of the major Arab conquests in Central Asia for about a quarter century. A quarter century is a long time on a frontier. It means momentum stopped, plans stalled, and some earlier gains became harder to hold. Older scholarship even treats his death as the beginning of rollback in parts of the region. Rollback matters because it shows these victories were not carved into stone. They had to be maintained through administration, alliances, garrisons, and support from the center, not just remembered in poetry. That is why Qutaybah's career should not be read as endless, unstoppable expansion. It should be read as a sharp lesson in how empires move fast and then wobble. His success came from three linked strengths: force in battle, administration after battle, and local alliances that made rule workable. Take away any one of those three strengths, and places like Bukhara or Samarkand become much harder to hold. Take away central backing in 715, and even a commander with a decade of victories can die in mutiny. There is another important point hiding under the conquest story. Qutaybah spread Muslim political rule quickly, but deeper Islamization in Central Asia came much more slowly. Political conquest came first in places like Sogdiana and Khwarazm. Later administrators, traders, scholars, and local conversion patterns did much of the longer work. That means watching Qutaybah's army arrive was not the same as watching a whole society change in 1 week. It was the start of a political layer, not the instant completion of a cultural one. That slower pattern matters because it keeps the story honest. Too many empire stories act like taking Samarkand means remaking Samarkand overnight. The research points the other way. Rule can move fast, while belief, identity, and daily life move much slower. So if you picture Bukhara under Qutaybah, picture both speed and delay. Speed in the arrival of troops, tribute, and garrisons. Delay in deeper religious and social change, which depended on many people after Qutaybah's own lifetime. That tension makes his story stronger, not weaker. It shows that he was building a frontier order, not waving a wand over Central Asia. And frontier orders are always exposed. They are exposed to revolt in places like Khwarazm, to factional tension in Khurasan, and to succession fights in Damascus. Qutaybah managed the first two for years. He could not survive the third in 715. That is the image to keep in your mind when you hear his name. A commander rises from relative obscurity, becomes governor of Khurasan around 704, and drives outward with about 50 EO00 troops. He recovers Lower Turkestan and Balkh in 705, pressures Bukhara from 706 to 709, and captures Samarkand by 712. He pushes into Jaxartes and Ferghana by 713 to 715, looking almost unbeatable at the edge of the map. Then one death in the capital, one new ruler named Suleiman, and one failed bid for loyalty end it all. That is what it was like watching Qutaybah's army arrive. When Qutaybah became governor of Khurasan around 704, one standard reference gives him command over roughly 50 000 troops, which meant frontier ambition suddenly had muscle. The first major phase came in 705 with Lower Turkestan and Balkh, where recovery and control gave him a base for deeper moves beyond the Oxus. From 706 to 709, Bukhara became a central problem because conquering a rich city matters less if the surrounding ground can still rise behind you. That is why Qutaybah did more than raid, using Arab settlement and garrisoning in places like Bukhara so victory would stay after the banners moved on. Between 710 and 712, the campaign widened through the Oxus Valley and Sogdiana, then reached the great prize of Samarkand with Khwarazm also under his power. Later tradition even pushes him toward Chinese Turkestan, but that easternmost claim is not securely documented and should not be told like certain fact. Older scholarship stressed administration because Qutaybah knew Arab tribal strength alone could not permanently hold every city and river crossing in Central Asia. So he leaned heavily on Persian cooperation, Persian agents, and at times Persian governors, showing that empire at the edge often runs on borrowed local knowledge. He also tried to calm Arab factional divisions, because a frontier commander fighting rival tribes inside camp cannot rule Bukhara or Samarkand for long. Keeping local rulers in place under Arab supervision was another tool, and it let him turn defeated elites into working parts of the new system. Local auxiliary troops stretched his reach even farther, proving that conquest was not one pure Arab column, marching alone from oasis to oasis. Still, the campaigns were not gentle, because siege warfare, tribute demands, punitive violence, and coercion shaped the frontier as much as diplomacy did. Stories about the educated classes of Khwarazm being wiped out after revolt are often repeated, but the later and biased sources mean careful wording matters here. Political conquest also came faster than Islamization because long-term religious change depended on later scholars, traders, administrators, and local conversion patterns. That gap between military rule and deeper social change is one reason frontier victory can look strong in one decade and fragile in the next. The fatal turn came in 715 when Al-Walid died, because Qutaybah had opposed Sulayman's succession and now feared what the new ruler would do. Instead of quietly submitting, he moved toward rebellion, which meant the conqueror of distant cities now had to test loyalty inside his own camp. He failed that test because he could not secure the full loyalty of his army, and the same troops who built his power mutinied against him. His death in 715 did not come from Samarkand, Bukhara, or Khwarazm striking back in one final battle. It came from his own soldiers turning inward. Older scholarship says his fall marked not only the end of major Arab conquest in Central Asia for about a quarter century, but also the start of rollback. That is the hard lesson at the edge of empire. Force, administration, and alliances can push a frontier far, but one shift in succession politics can shake the whole structure loose. Qutaybah's story feels epic, because cities like Bukhara and Samarkand fell outward. Yet the final collapse came inward, from a mutiny that frontier glory could not prevent. You were seeing real power, real fear, real administration, and real brutality moving together through Central Asia. But you were also seeing something temporary, because even great frontier victories still answer to politics at the center. If you want the next story after Qutaybah, watch the fall of another frontier commander whose victories collapsed the moment the capital changed its mind.